Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a Euractiv hybrid conference supported by Microsoft. I'm Mariam Zaidi, and I will be your moderator for tonight's event. Now, today we're going to be discussing how can the European Democracy Action Plan empower citizens and build more resilient democracies across the EU. A big welcome to everyone who is joining us here in the room and also to our online audience. And for everyone, whether you're here or joining online, remember to send in your questions or your comments into our Slido chat page. I have my iPad right here and I'll be receiving your questions, and we will come to your questions later on in the program, so do get involved. Now, if I was to ask you what is the biggest threat to democracy right now, what would you say? Would you say Russia? Would you say China? Would you say social media giants? Or perhaps the threat is closer to home. It's our own politicians and our trust in what they say. Now, whatever you believe, we are living in a very polarized world. The polarization itself has in some ways become normalized. The most recent example I can think of is the recent Italian elections. Italy went sort of full tilt from Mr. Euro Mario Draghi to the Brothers of Italy, a party with fascist origins. But that is democracy, that's Italy's choice. But it does lead to a fascinating question, or questions. Are the choices that we make the evolution of a resilient democracy, or are we being manipulated by disinformation in an increasingly digitalized world? I know our panelists have something to say about that. Now, in 2020, the European Commission had a democratic reckoning of its own, a new roadmap, the European Democratic Action Plan, which is born to turn the tide against rising information, polarization, curbs on freedoms, and interference. Now, the three pillars are essentially promoting free and fair elections, strengthening media freedom, and countering that disinformation that we see literally everywhere. In an increasingly digitalized world, of course, that last pillar is extremely important. But is this blueprint that the EU has come up with, is it really right for Europe, especially Europe in a changing world? And what can the tech and private sectors do to advance our democratic norms? Well, let's ask our experts. Now, this evening's debate is part of an event series, Democratic Values in the Digital Age, where Microsoft has teamed up with three academic think tanks, the UCD in Ireland, Globsec in Slovakia, and CEDMO in the Czech Republic. And we're going to hear from those think tanks, but first of all, we're going to hear from Daniel Brown. Good evening, Deputy Head of Cabinet of the European Commission's Vice President, Vera Jourova. Now, Vice President Jourova's mandate covers values and transparency, democracy, and rule of law. She is, by all accounts, a champion of the EADP. So, Mr. Brown, it's a pleasure to have you kick off our debate. Please go ahead.
Thank you and good evening. I never heard democratic reckoning before. It sounds more grandiose than I'm used to. Yeah, no. So indeed, what was it? A year and a half ago, we came with the EDAP, with the European Democracy Action Plan, in the middle of COVID. So that was the context to react to democratic backsliding, to react to the dangers that were, I would say, accelerated by COVID, election interference, spread of disinformation, threats against journalists, and of course the challenges brought by digitalization, as you mentioned. I think it's part of a general trend in European policymaking that we want technologies and invest in them and in the people that can use the technologies, but we also want to see that they are developed and used in a safe way. With fundamental rights and freedoms, that is the European approach. This is reflected in the European Democracy Action Plan. You named the three pillars that were supposed to strengthen the resilience of European democracy and address the most vulnerable parts of the democracy. So that's why we have the election part, and we've already done quite a lot with regulation on transparency of political advertising. There will be further actions on foreign interference in elections, on media, the Media Freedom Act, of course, that is the most recent, but also protection of journalists against physical violence, but also legal abuse. and countering disinformation with many things that have been done with the Digital Services Act, with the Code of Practice that I'm sure that we will discuss further. And these three pillars are interconnected. We are in a very dangerous situation. People believe less and less that democracies work for them. For that, in that context, we have the Russian disinformation waves, which has a security aspect because Russia knows that we are a democracy, and they need to undermine the public support for the measures that the EU is taking. So I think it's even strengthened to what we have seen. We have issues like spyware. So that's the context that will, however, not stay. I mean, without any progress and movement. So the president of the Commission announced strengthening of the European Democracy Action Plan with a Defense of Democracy package. So that is something that we will be working on in the next few weeks to months.
Weeks to months. So I think you gave a good round of what the action plan is. And as I touched upon earlier, the three academic think tanks which have partnered up with Microsoft host workshops around the three pillars of the EDP, and they have questions for you, if you're okay with that. So first we'll hear from SEDSMO, from Anya Grabovitz, project manager. If you'd like to go ahead with your question, please.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm happy to join this event, one of the workshops in a series that you mentioned before. So I'm the project manager of SEDSMO, which is a Central European Digital Media Observatory, just to kind of, for you to understand who we are, what we do. It's a multidisciplinary project supported by the EU Commission, and we're partnering with actually 8 organization partners across the Central Europe. So in the Czech Republic, Prague, where I'm currently based, then Slovakia and Poland. So we're covering this region. And the aim of what we do is to firstly identify, then research, and also trying to kind of prioritize the sources and causes of disinformation or information disorder, which is what we call it as well. And given that one of the pillars in the European Democracy Action Plan is actually focusing on that, on fighting disinformation, my question would be actually how to avoid interfering with freedom of speech in the EDAP initiatives when they deal with legal content.
Okay, I hope you heard that question then. So it was how to avoid interfering with freedom of speech in the action plan when they deal with legal content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're very blurry, Anya, but I could hear well. So, I mean, first thing, freedom of speech is not absolute, and we must not be naive. The disinformation actors intentionally manipulate online platforms, the information environment, to undermine freedom of speech, to drown voices. So to mitigate these vulnerabilities, it's actually strengthening free speech and related fundamental rights. Second, I just came from a discussion with the Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa, and she mentioned a study showing the famous MIT study showing that lies travel further and faster than the truth. So there are incentives built in the information system that disadvantage facts. So this is fully reflected in the EU policies, where when it's not illegal, we have to be cautious. But this is not a matter of freedom of speech; it's a matter of distribution of information. And we're not regulating the content, but rather ensuring that the actors in the information space have the capacities to mitigate the risks that their services bring. They are often invisible, these risks. We need all hands on board, by the way, and EDMO and SEDMO are a very important part of this multi-layered issue that needs to be also addressed in a multi-layered way. So that would be my maybe reply, that this is not a freedom of speech issue, but rather a distribution issue.
I think that's a good distinction to make. And I hope, Anya, that answered your question. Next, we have Yana Kazaz, Research Fellow from GlobSec. If you'd like to go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. So, as was said, my name is Yana Kazaz. I represent GlobSec's Center for Democracy and Resilience. We are based in Bratislava. And our center is conducting research in the areas on information operations, hybrid threats, election interference, and countering disinformation, especially now coming from Russia. Therefore, the most vital part of European Democracy Action Plan, actually really relevant for us, is part of countering the disinformation. And the question I have is related to the new code of practice on disinformation. And I would like to ask you, which are the three main novelties of new code as compared to the old one from 2018? Thank you.
Thank you. So without stealing too much from Christina, I will on general level mention, first of all, it's a totally new quality of policy making, I would say, and a natural evolution. I mean, there are the commitments are much better and more concrete, and they are underpinned by legislation that we have at our hand with the Digital Services Act now. Second, transparency as the underlying principle in more ways. First, to check whether the platforms and other actors that are part of the code implement what they promised to implement, and that there's a way to verify the commitments and their fulfillment, but also to empower people like you and researchers to understand what is happening really in the information space, and to have access to data. And I'm sure we will develop on that, so I stop here, but it's clear that we cannot rely only on platforms to understand what is happening, and we need to, let's say, open up the space and the playground where the information flows are taking place. And the third biggest change is what we call the whole of society approach. I think we managed to, and thanks to Christina and Paulo, predecessors, we managed to get around one table the large platforms, small platforms, the advertising industry, because there's a lot of economic incentives behind this information, companies providing technological solutions, civil society actors, including GlobSec. So having such a complex problem that you have upstream polluters of the information space, you have a system with incentives, as we just discussed, fostering rather lies and emotions than facts, and being biased against facts, and having perhaps increasing parts of the population for many reasons prone to disinformation. It's clear that we can't do it only with legislation and only from Brussels. So managing to have everybody on board was a big thing.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I hope that answered your question. I saw Christina was nodding ahead, so he did a good enough job there. Okay, over to our third question. Our last question is from Elizabeth, or Liz Farris, the Director of UCD Digital Policy Programmes from University College Dublin. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, great to see everyone here today. That's right. I am Elizabeth Farris. I co-direct the UCD Centre for Digital Policy in Ireland, and our centre looks very broadly at building digital policy capability for professionals in Ireland, but also at the EU level. And so we hosted the first session of the series in Dublin last month, looking at EDAP on the topic of strengthening media pluralism and strengthening media freedoms. And we had a really lively discussion stemming from that workshop. And when we talk about the conundrum the multiple conundrums presented for media freedom in our digital age, I wonder if we might have an opportunity now to break down some of the regulatory processes there. So my question, thanks to Mr. Braun for being here today, my question to you relates to the regulation of that space, particularly the Media Freedom Act. And I wonder if you might be able to break down a little bit what the key elements of the Media Freedom Act are. Why is the Commission engaging in media regulation at all, given the sensitivities here?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's an important context that if we're talking about information disorders, we don't only talk about dampening the voice of disinformation, but also promoting the trustworthy voices, and the long-term game is resilience, where civil society and media play a key role, obviously. The underlying context of the Media Freedom Act is that the media is not just another economic sector. It's a pillar of democracy, it's a public watchdog, and professional media have a key role in creating a shared reality. So we cannot treat it as a regular in I don't know, assessing mergers and acquisitions, as a regular economic operator. So we need to have a functioning media market so that journalists can do their jobs, which is not just a regular economic activity, as I said. More practically, the Media Freedom Act came as a result of cases of questionable, let's say, acquisitions and mergers in some member states, of surveillance of journalists and increasing threats. And this builds on the work that we already did in the European Democracy Action Plan earlier on protecting the safety of journalists, both physical and legal, as I said, the SLAP directive and the recommendation on safety of journalists. So quickly, the key points of the Media Freedom Act. First of all, there are safeguards to protect the independence of editorial activities or editorial decisions. There's provisions on transparency on media ownership, and safeguards for fair distribution of state advertising, because that we have also seen being used in certain parts of the world and Europe. Third, I would mention there's an encouragement for online platforms to pay specific attention to professional media and to content produced through professional standards. And last but not least, there's an upgrade of the group of media regulators into a media board, European Media Board, which will set up a system of coordination of national authorities that assess, for instance, mergers and various steps done by public bodies on the media sector. So there's a new safeguard when there's a merger or there's a step in the direction of media concentration. This should be assessed through a media pluralism test. And maybe one last remark, because we're talking about disinformation and foreign interference as a connected thing. This cooperation of national regulators should also make it easier to counter foreign interference that is often done by, let's say, fake media outlets or whatever they can be called. So this is it. As for the question, why are we interfering? Yeah, I would say
why are you interfering?
I would call it really protecting and safeguarding a fourth estate of democracies.
Yeah, no, and that's really brilliant to hear. Well, thank you, Daniel. We're going to have to leave this section. So UCD, Globsec and ZMO, thank you for taking part. And I hope that's grounded everyone in the sort of main tenets of EDAP. Okay, well, as you can see, these lovely ladies have been waiting extremely patiently. And what I'd also like to say, it's awesome to always see so many women, you know, in a discussion like this. So maybe give them a round of applause before they, yeah. Okay, so first of all, let's go to Christina Stump, Head of Unit Media Convergence and Social Media at DG Connect, European Commission. Please go ahead for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It will be my pleasure to speak a little bit more about the new code of practice on disinformation that in my view is actually a true new deal in the fight against disinformation. Because as already stated by the previous speaker, it has very strong commitments, it has a strong multi-stakeholder signatory base, and it has a strong regulatory backstop. So let me elaborate a bit more on these elements. So first of all, strong commitments, strong tools. While the signatories have really looked very deeply, unsurprisingly, they did not find one magic pill, one silver bullet to fight disinformation. At the same time, they came up with a very strong and powerful toolbox with a variety of tools that altogether can be very efficient in fighting disinformation. What are these tools? Just on a very high level. One of them is demonetization. That means basically to cut the financial incentives when it comes to propagating disinformation. And this we have seen regarding the COVID crisis, apart from players who are disseminating disinformation for political agenda, there are also a lot of players who are also disseminating disinformation because in order to make money. Neither of the two should get financial incentives to do that. Then another important area is a special area of advertising, political advertising. Here the code goes hand in hand with the legislative initiative on political advertising with industry-led tools to make sure that political advertising can be easily recognized by the users. Then another important area, in particular in the current geopolitical situation, is to provide tools against manipulative behavior. So all these techniques that are used to make disinformation viral and to spread them. Then another very important area is user empowerment tools. So basically to equip the users with good tools to be able to recognize disinformation, also to flag disinformation, and to navigate better in the current online environment. Then another important area is fact-checking. Fact-checking is a very useful and very powerful tool, and the code makes sure that this is used EU-wide as well as all other commitments in the code that have to be implemented across the EU. And last but not least, data access is obviously a very important instrument in this area to make sure that there is transparency, that researchers can look into the data to study and respond to this information. So this is a very high-level overview of the commitment. So this is one of the key strengths of the code to come up with this variety of tools, and you will see none of them is about removal. So here we also are very mindful of the freedom of speech. Then the other strength is indeed the very strong signatory base, as already mentioned. Not just big platforms are on board, but also smaller platforms where this information is also present. Civil society organizations, fact-checkers, at the advertising sector in order to be efficient on demonetization. And all these players all together can be much more powerful to fight disinformation because no player alone is able to fight disinformation on its own. And then to come to the regulatory issue, if this code should not be sufficient enough to fight, which is already the case, there is the Digital Services act behind. So basically here we have a very strong regulatory tool to make sure that this code is working in practice.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much. It's backed up by legislation there. Next, we'll go to our online panelist, Andre Gobans, member of the European Economic and Social Committee. Please go ahead for your opening statement.
It's such a shame I cannot be with you in Brussels. I'm here in Czech Republic, where we have the EU presidency, and actually I think it's extremely important that we, as well as civil society representatives representing civil society in Brussels at the EU level, go into the regions and take a closer look what's happening in the member states. So sorry for not being in the so-called European capital, but being in another place where it's actually crucial as well to be and to have a look and support and strengthen democracy. Well, the Economic and Social Committee is very much in favor of the action plan. It won't be a big surprise, but it won't be a big surprise for you that actually we say it's far not enough. It's extremely welcome, but actually it is only a first and a small step, so to say, ahead in the right direction. And most probably Alexandrina will point out several things as well, who will speak right after me, on how things should be done. The things which we demand is that actually media is great and important, elections is great and important, everything about ads and slaps and everything is key and crucial, but actually don't we forget one important puzzle piece in this game when strengthening democracy, because democracy needs action every day, and every day by us as citizens, as individuals, and as organized civil society. Both is crucial, individual level and organized input and cooperation in bringing our ideas forward for a better future and a better democracy. And this is the key piece which is missing at this moment, or actually quite weak in the action plan. So we very much hope that, for example, as well with Mrs. von der Leyen's speech just a couple of weeks ago, where she said that actually democracy needs to be defended and we need more action than already agreed on, that I hope that in this package there will be a fourth pillar, so to say, as we demand it in the action plan, which would focus on civil society and a vibrant environment where this civil society can act, engage, and creates its own future.
Okay, thank you so much. You brought up a fourth pillar, and Alexandrina Naimovic, you also, just before we actually went live, you were also talking about a fourth pillar. So let me now go over to you. You are Secretary General at the European Civic Forum. Please go ahead with your opening statement.
Thank you. So Andris very nicely bridged between institutions and civil society, and this is precisely what we are trying to do at the European Civic Forum, to bridge between citizens and European institutions. I do agree that we need civil society to be considered a fourth, a fifth pillar, depending on the different strategies and action plans. Because indeed, civil society not only plays a crucial role in defending democracy, civil society is an important checks and balances element, as it is recognized indeed in the European Democracy Action Plan. But also civil society is daily in contact with citizens, with their needs. So civil society can be a very valuable ally for the institutions, not only to promote and to help institutions enact and enforce legislation, but also to alert on the shortcomings of European and national policies. And this brings me to a dimension that I would like to touch upon while thinking about democracy. We very much discussed so far about a functional aspect of democracy, which of course is a very important one. But I would like to draw attention on the fact that indeed citizens look at how democracy works, but I would tend to think about the citizens that look more into what democracy delivers in terms of policies that leave no one behind. And if we look also at the Daniel Brown just said that there are certain populations that are more prone to disinformation or to, let's say, fall in the trap of xenophobic, nationalist, regressive populist narratives. And these people, maybe it's not necessarily because they were born autocrats in their minds, but if we look at research and at opinion polls, well, it turns that these people actually are those that would be at the margins of our societies. They feel left behind. They have the sensation that current policies do not deliver for their needs. So I would invite us all, and particularly the European Commission and the European Union, while thinking about how to fix democracy, to constantly have in mind these two legs of democracy, the policies that we deliver and the mechanisms that we have to safeguard democracy and to make the society participate not only once in every 5 years through elections, but also to have civil society empowered. And Andris is very much agreeing with me. Civil society empowered together with the social partners and businesses to really be part of a European policy dialogue that we still need, I think, to widen and to construct.
So let me ask, just as a follow-up question then, and let's open up this debate then. Do you think democracy is in crisis?
Oh, I do.
Expand, please.
I do, well, I think we are living a multifold crisis of democracy. You introduced by saying that, of course, democracy is threatened from outside, democracy is threatened from within. And I think the biggest threat to democracy is citizens losing trust in democracy as such, as a principle of governance. And I think this happens not necessarily, maybe the root cause is not necessarily in the first place disinformation. I would rather look at disinformation as an effect of it, as an easy way actually to build political capital on people's dissatisfaction with democracy. So yeah, I think that it is very important to look at the root causes.
Okay, well, Andris, let me come back to you again. Do you think that the norms or the common ground that we once had, that we once shared, are sort of outdated because the world is now just so different?
Whoa. If I might start with where Alexandrina ended, she said actually that democracy is under threat. At the meantime, democracy is as attractive as never before. What we see, for example, the big fear of the tyrant in Russia. Why does he bomb Ukraine? Is because he fears that he will lose, and he knows that he's a loser, and he will lose power if there would be a fair democratic country system in his own country. And he fears that Ukraine already has proven that in a democratic state you can live better, and his own people were asking, why can't we live as the Ukrainians live? So it's actually, he's fearing about his personal benefits, enriching, all those thieves around him, and the attractiveness of democracy. And also in China, we see that people go, or even Iran, people are going out in the streets demanding peace and participation. So just starting with this. But then again, as linking that to your question about the new challenges which we have, yes, we do have new and bigger challenges, and these are actually quite well, again, with the first step in this European Action Plan covered by the Commission's plans, because I think the new realities that we can live, each one of us can live in a bubble without real connection to real world. Well, this is a new challenge which we cannot ignore. And where we as European societies, that's not a thing which we can do at national level, because member states are not strong enough when dealing with tech giants and all these developments which exist out there, is we have to see how populism, radicalism, also terroristic ideas are not misusing social media, and why that they don't get amplified, but that there is also access to quality information to everyone. So some kind of challenge for our bubbles, I would say, that is needed, and that is a new system which most probably 10 years ago was quite different.
Well, is the action plan, I mean, perhaps Daniel, you can take this one, is the action plan a kind of realization that, you know, a previously economic union that became a political union of 27 member states, of people and cultures, different identities, different cultures, different languages, different legal systems, different everything, that it was always going to have bumps in the roads and problems, and therefore you needed to maybe come up with something a little bit different for the times and for the changes that we are seeing across the member states?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, as I said, the context was really multiple crises that accelerated, I think, trends that we have seen for a longer time. The democratic backsliding is not totally new. And what we tried to do in the European Democracy Action Plan was to look really what you can call upstream and downstream. So downstream, looking at the resilience of societies, of people, and I fully agree on the importance of civil society there and media. I think they are the frontline fighters in the information space for democracy, and the principles that bind us together in the European Union. We have to look at how the information disorders and the democratic backsliding is actually being done. What are the channels? What are the ways? And there are actors in this space that have not been accountable, but that have assumed a very important role in the society and in democracy. I mean, 20 years ago, the platforms were just a collection of e-shops, if I make it very oversimplistic. But we see that there's no online environment and offline life. It's just one life, and this has to be remedied, and the responsibilities of actors have to be changed. So and besides that, besides this environment, there are malicious actors within the EU and outside. So I think it was a realization that, and it was said here, in order to preserve democracy with all these threats, internal, external, and the incentives built in the system, we need to nurture democracy, and we need to have legal framework where it's missing with democratic oversight. And we need to have, I mean, if you look at the EDAP, the European Democracy Action Plan, it's a work plan. It's loads of initiatives that we are rolling out to increase the resilience. That is something I would come back to. This is not going to be a magic bullet and a static thing. And yes, we will develop it further. I mean, you could call it EDAP 2, the new Defense of Democracy package. Happy to elaborate later. But this is what I would
so
say.
A work plan to fix democratic backsliding. Cornelia, your thoughts. Did I also miss you out for your opening statement?
Yes.
I apologize. The list is
fine.
so long.
I'll make it a little bit longer now.
Yeah, so please go ahead. I apologize for that.
No, don't worry. So I'll go back to your very first question and in like where we are with democracy. And so the backsliding, as Daniel explained, is not only happening in Europe. It's a global situation, and so as a global company, we're looking at this in all areas where it is happening. Obviously, we've seen it a lot in the United States with the 2016, 2020 elections. We've seen it in Brazil. And we've also seen reactions coming from different governments around the world that act fairly fiercely in some, like in Australia, for example, or in some where, unfortunately, the regulatory response is missing. And you can definitely see that in other countries. So
as multi-layered the responses are from the European Commission, we have addressed this also in a multi-layered approach. So we've been looking at, for example, what's happening on the media's news front with more detailed analysis in how there has been a decline in local news media rooms across the United States. What have we have done certain projects in this space, first as a pilot in the United States. We're trying to roll this out here. And many of the initiatives that we have driven in the United States, we're reflecting how to expand them to Europe. But in Europe, of course, the regulatory environment is a little bit different. So we have, I think, a twofold role here. First of all, as a stakeholder in society, where we are advancing public-private partnerships. I think public-private partnerships are of essence in tackling the multitude of different issues. I'll come back later on to what that involves, for example, in the context of foreign interference and cyber threats and analysis that companies like ours can provide. But also as a addressee of many of the regulatory initiatives that the Commission has started. The COP, we are a signatory, of course, the DSA, we are an addressee, we are in scope and basically with all our digital services to different degrees, how that relates back. Even with the Media Freedom Act, we might actually be regulated on both sides. Well, we're still looking at this in which of our services could potentially be considered a media publisher versus where we are definitely in scope is as an online platform. And so that's an analysis that's still ongoing. It's going to be really interesting in looking at this in a multifaceted role. So I hope we have a little bit more time later on to talk about the Media Freedom Act, because I think that's sort of like the crown jewel maybe of the European Democracy Action Plan, because it goes to the essence of how to safeguard media pluralism. And that's a very, very complicated role of the Commission to take because of the competences they have vis-a-vis the member states. And I will just say that I congratulate the Commission for doing this bold step in going into this direction, and we'll have to see how this goes through the legislative process. So I find that a really interesting part of the discussion. From a Microsoft perspective, where we can really support many of the aspects is, of course, where technology comes into play. So that is in identifying, for example, deepfakes, in providing authoritative content, and in particular in supporting threat analysis in the context of disinformation, threats from foreign interference, in particular now, of course, in the context of Russia. So I'll stay there, but there we can dig into all of them. Maybe just on the political advertising, it's a really interesting one for us because Microsoft on its services, and Christina, you know that from the COP, we do not allow political advertising on our services. But of course, once there is a regulation, now we are looking at the regulation and look at how it is defined, because ultimately we might have in our terms of use currently a slightly different definition of political advertising than the outcome of that legislative file, and then we would need to adapt accordingly. And so there's this multitude of roles we play, and I wish we can focus a lot on the public-private partnership, because there has to be this understanding that all players in a democracy can contribute to this, whether this is civil society on my right, institutions, or industry, frankly.
Well, let's pick up on what you're saying about the role that big tech sort of plays. And if we think about, as you were saying, deep fakes, technology, digitalization is all advancing at such a pace now. Do you think I mean, for you, you mentioned, obviously the US, you've also mentioned Europe. What was the sort of seismic event in recent times, would you say, that really sort of made tech sort of look up and realize and say, oh gosh, this disinformation is getting way out of control? I mean, for me, I would say, especially for Europe, it would be the time of Brexit, because they seem to have learnt from the US what they could do. And we saw the sort of misinformation that went on during Brexit and since Brexit. So was that maybe a point, especially for the EU and for tech companies, that they saw that, we can literally weaponize people for our causes? And did it make, big tech or people at Microsoft just pause for a second there?
I think for Europe, it was certainly the awakening Brexit, the Brexit vote, and many, as I certainly remember, the next day. And
I think all of us remember the next day.
So this sheer disbelief that this is happening. But I don't think it was the first sign. I think there were other events that, frankly, where eventually, when you think about life-threatening events, more relevant, like Myanmar, for example, the genocide there, and of course, the elections, where when you and I just read what everybody else reads in the newspapers and the books that have been published in the meantime, like The Ugly Truth, for example, where you are like, where I think there has been issues. Cambridge Analytica might have been also an awakening in this space. So there have been several that led to, at least in Microsoft, to realization that there needs to be something done. And our services obviously are not the main vectors in the disinformation space. So we come into this and leaning in both in how we are regulated, but also in what we can else do and how we can else support these efforts that are undertaken by many civil society groups, think tanks, and obviously the European Commission.
Talking to the European Commission, you stump, Christina. Obviously, digitalization, disinformation go hand in hand, but just picking up on these sort of big seismic events, things like Brexit, or the events that sort of led us to this big, that things were happening. Is there a feeling that around this sort of period, or 2015, 2016, that big tech sort of realized that we can literally destroy democracies if we want to? Are they the biggest threat to our democracy?
I believe that online platforms have certainly a big potential to be vectors of the spread of disinformation, or to bear certain risks in the way they are distributing the information and disinformation. At the same time, I believe that we should not see them as a threat, but rather address their potential for spreading disinformation. Because in the same way that it can be used to spread disinformation, it can bring to people very useful information. And maybe just to add, one other wake-up call, or rather a big crisis when it comes to disinformation, that was the COVID crisis. It is less related to democracy in the strict sense. At the same time, it has shown very well that while science was able to produce safe and efficient vaccines in record time, on social media, in record time, disinformation was spread in a scale that was basically threatening to undermine all these efforts. So I think with this, now with the Ukraine crisis, we see it very well, how this can really destroy efforts in different areas. At the same time, I believe that now we know more, and also we have to use the potential of technology to reduce these risks when it comes to recognizing this type of disinformation, deep fakes, reduce the virality. And I think in the code, we have a lot of instruments there that builds on technology, that also builds on the use of civil society fact checkers, that all together can reduce these risks that online platforms bring.
Okay, well then let's come to EDAP then. Daniel, your boss, she said that democracy can't be taken for granted, and this democracy action plan is designed to empower citizens and build resilient democracies. But what if empowering them today means giving them the power to say and do as they please, rather than perhaps force them to uphold a set of beliefs that no longer are applicable to what we are going through today? There are, as we're saying, society is becoming very polarized. We're seeing people who are on the extreme right, the extreme left. Does EDAP represent them?
Yes, my boss said that, so I confirm that, first of all. I think in democracy we have to respect all points of view as long as they are legal. Having illiberal or far-fetched opinions is not a crime. This is the big difference between democracy and autocracy or authoritarian regimes. Talking about COVID, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it. There's a similar ECHR judgment from 1970s that says basically the same. Yeah, no. So the EDAP recognizes this problem. It's a holistic. It's for this reason that it's a holistic plan. So we want to create conditions where people can form their opinions free of manipulation. I think that is the underlying logic, and that has to do with the role of civil society and media. That has to do with fighting disinformation, which is not only lies, it's also the behavior of the actors in the system and the framing. It's the manipulation. So it's empowering the people to be able to do that, including those that feel frustrated or are on the fringes. And I think with the crises, this risk of fringes becoming bigger is real. So it's also a big task for the politicians and for democratic systems to deliver for these people. This is not something that the EDAP can do. It aims to empower people to form their opinions, but above that, there has to be a system that is able to deal, with energy prices and with the external threats that we face. But certainly, it's not about. That's the European approach. We're not other parts of the world. We're not regulating content. We're regulating responsibilities and due diligence of actors and empowering the people to be able to form the opinions they want.
Exactly. Perhaps, Andris, you could go. You could follow up on what Daniel said there. Do you think EDAP really looks to empower and restore trust? What are your thoughts?
Well, empowerment, I don't really like that wording so much because it's a little bit a top-down. I like very much bottom-up, and I truly believe in bottom-up societies and in civil society and democracy, which organizes itself and participates and not which is involved by someone else. So just a simple remark on this. Well, perhaps three remarks, if I might. First, on big tech. One thing which we say about EDAP is that actually big tech needs transparency. If there is an algorithm behind, and if I suddenly, once I was clicking some populist or radical whomever person, and I get served next time, I get 5, 6, 7 times, again, stronger and more populist and more radical people, and also others, get clear information why I do get all this trash on my social networks. Why is it included, and why is it offered to me that often simply after once clicking on the wrong video? So transparency is a key moment, and I think I very much hope on this Democracy Action Plan 2, which was promised that there would come soon, because I think these are the things which might be regulated more specifically in how these transparency issues regulate with big tech. When talking to business, that would be my second point. I think that's, again, a difficult and a strong question, not only about Brexit. Brexit, of course, showed that actually business most probably should have done more, because the interests of business were deeply damaged by the Brexit vote. And it showed clearly that just stepping aside and looking on things, how they're happening, and how some populists might gain audience, etc., that might not be enough also from company side, because it damages at the end of the day also companies' interests and employment possibilities and gaining money. So business needs to be more active and involved in defending democracy actively. It's not only about corporate social responsibility, but also about active involvement. And I think in business, we need to talk also about collaboration risks, because there's still so many companies, I don't want to name anyone here around the table, but who are still trading in Russia and with their taxes supporting this criminal war. So those are extremely difficult questions, of course, which need to be answered, but it shows that not everything has to be regulated, but we as citizens, and citizens are running businesses as well, have to be more aware of these democracy issues as such. So first, big tech, we need more transparency. Second is more responsibility from everyone, because we have, each and every one of us have to reapprove democracy every day. And the third, and I'm sorry for coming back, I hope we might nail down this one point during this discussion, that we get a real civil society perspective in the next upcoming action plan. Civil society organizations are saying that it might be also an option to have simply a civil society strategy, which might and should be developed at EU level. Perhaps we can get already the next step, knowing that actually the war has created a new reality and democracy needs double attention as before, and perhaps we can already get some slight insight in the Commission's plans on this. And already, yes, we will go ahead with this strategy for civil society, or fourth pillar, however we call it.
Okay, I can see that you really want that question to be answered. But would you like to go ahead? Sure, go ahead.
With
fourth
pleasure.
Pillar.
Yeah. So first of all, I think transparency is regulated very thoroughly in the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice vis-a-vis regulators, vis-a-vis users, and vis-a-vis research. So just to address that point. Yeah, no, I don't exclude anything. It's early days. I mean, we've done a lot, I think, with the EDAP, but the threats to democracies are evolving, as we all acknowledged, and they are more acute now after COVID and with the Russian war against Ukraine. And we have to close the loopholes that we see that appeared. I mean, the focus at this point is really foreign interference. So that is one component that will be in that package, a legislative initiative to look at covert foreign influence, and yeah, we're protecting our economic interests through screening of investments, and we have to do the same with our values and democracy as well. So we will be looking at transparency to make sure there's clarity on who the foreign persons or organisms are who are present in our systems. We don't have that yet, so we will be looking at that. And I don't think it's really about pillars, but the second component of this package will be an opportunity to look at whether the EDAP needs to be reviewed, whether further steps are needed. For sure, this will look very closely at civil society. I cannot exclude anything. I cannot exclude, that there will be a specific focus on civil society. I cannot promise anything either, because we're only, making the scoping. But by summer next year, you will see these two elements, a review of what we have in the EDAP, where civil society, I would insist, is very strongly present, both in the narrative and in the actions, in all the three pillars as key actors in the fight against disinformation. If you look at the first pillar on elections, and it's actually, I think the pillar is called not only election integrity, but participation of public in democracy. There's a lot of
there was
lot
one
of
thing
measures.
I wanted to actually ask you about under the first pillar and political funding reviews and better transparency of political ads. Are you putting spending caps in place?
We are not putting spending caps in place because we don't have any competence on that. This is about transparency of targeting with political messages by political actors and beyond. As regards funding caps, this is for the national authorities to enforce. Each member state has their own rules. We have also a parallel legislative proposal on European political parties, where we have financing provisions limiting certain, or I would say tightening the screws. And we have recommended that member states be inspired by this. I think this is certainly an element that also in the context of this foreign influence needs to be looked at further.
Okay, well, I'm very aware that our time is running out quite quickly, so I'm going to start speeding through a few questions. So we'll go to the second pillar. I know you said you didn't want to talk about pillars. So perhaps, Cornelia, you could take this one. If we look at press freedom across the EU27, it's quite stark. And I can sort of set the scene for everyone. Reporters Without Borders says in 2022, the EU is caught between polarization to the west, war and propaganda to the east. It adds the bloc is caught between two extremes, the very good and the very bad. And the 2021 index does show you this. You had 6 EU member states in the top 10, Denmark, Sweden, Estonia, Finland, they make the top 5. And then on the other side, you have countries like Greece, which are the worst performing member state at 108th. Hungary actually fares better at 85. Malta, 78th. So can or does, this action plan, can it better protect journalists? And add aside to that, what sort of blanket protection can tech or social media give to journalists? For example, blocking people online. What is the role that you can play in helping journalists to do their jobs?
Yeah, the developments on the risks that journalists have is staggering. And not only in areas where you would expect that, but frankly also online. And this curtails obviously also freedom of expression if journalists are threatened online in ways that they will eventually think twice to be in that space. I think there are a number of things that industry can do. First of all, maybe on the strengthening of the media pluralism part, the copyright directive is an essential tool, and it brings me a little bit, of course, there are a number of different tools that are there that will strengthen democracy that are not part of the action plan. When you think, for example, about hate speech, anything that relates to that, the DSA probably more generally will support strengthening democratic resilience. But on the media pluralism, I think an important point was the fair remuneration of publishers. So with the implementation of the Copyright Directive and Article 17 in particular in member states, this is now an important way of strengthening the economic resilience of media publishers by being actually paid for the content that platforms distribute. for free. So that's something that we have absolutely supported, and we were very strong coming out in the context of Australian happenings in this space. And it's a very interesting. We are obviously, again, it sounds really strange. We discussed at the beginning that I'm always saying we're actually a smaller player in this space, but we are. So Bing is has a under 10% market share in Europe, and so of course we even don't play for the publishers the significant role. So, but at least now that this is implemented in a number of countries, not in all yet, we are starting to see negotiations with publisher houses happening. We just signed a memorandum with the publisher associations, for example, in Denmark. That was a little bit easier because they are actually in one pot. So this is one of the areas that I think will significantly help the media landscape in being economically more resilient. At the same time, I will say that, of course, when you look at the Media Pluralism Observatory report 2021, you will see that there is a interplay between big platforms and big media houses. So we'll see how the Media Freedom Act will interplay with this. That's another aspect, I think, that requires a lot of discussion and understanding, and how that ultimately will support the goals. And then last, I think, again, as a technology provider, we are looking at technical tools to protect journalists. So we had rolled out Account Guard for election processes for political parties, and we have started to roll out the same protections also to journalists for their communication to be more secured.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to quickly just jump over to the last pillar, which is countering disinformation, and to an audience member's question. And Christina, I think this is a question for you. Alexander Nitz says, what are the reasons as to why the code was extended to misinformation, which EDAP defines as false content with no harmful intent? E.g., when people share false information with friends and family in good faith, does the, I think, Commission endorse this? And that's what we're trying to say.
Look, I believe that when drafting the code, we had to look, and the signatories had looked into this phenomenon again. And when it comes to definitions, indeed, the EDAP has its definitions. Also, the different platforms have looked into this with a broader eye. And we have seen it with COVID, that when it comes to disinformation, the intent is, in any event, a very difficult thing to establish. What is the intent behind? But with COVID, we have seen it very clearly that even information that is false, spread with a goodwill, can cause a lot of harm. You have seen the magic cures are related to COVID, giving you the information what kind of medicine you should take or cannot take, and we have seen that this can cause a lot of harm. At the same,
especially what the US president said.
Yes, I did not want to go into this, but indeed, that is a very good example. We don't know the intent, but it's good that we don't have to look at the intent in this case. At the same time, it's important to point to the code that the response may not be the same for disinformation and misinformation, how to fight it. So here, there can be also different responses, but I believe that in order to have a complex answer, we also, indeed, the signatories were right to include also this element into the code.
Okay, Alexandra, I'm going to come to you with a question now. It's from Manuel Alejandro Carmona. What possible weaknesses should be addressed in next year's review on the implementation of the EDAP?
I don't want to be self-referential and to
I know what you're going to say
again, and to bring it back to the civil society. But I do think that next to journalists and media, civil society becomes more and more vocal, actually, in playing the role of watchdog and checks and balances. A reason for which more and more civil society, alongside media and the judiciary, becomes an actor which suffers attacks from state and non-state actors. And this is quite well documented by civil society itself. We have our Civic Space Watch that allows us to look into all the legislative but also non-legislative threats that civil society is facing in using its right to associate and to articulate citizens' dissent, in using its right to get to the streets and articulate dissent in the streets. And this social dissatisfaction, unfortunately, is more and more met with heavy-handed policing and police violence, and not only in the East, but particularly in the West, in countries like France, the UK, or Spain. And so I do think that we really need to take this issue seriously. The rule of law annual review mechanism by the European Commission is looking at the issue, but there again, civil society is kind of horizontal trend in the broader checks and balances. So I really think that we would deserve a kind of a holistic strategy looking into the specificity of civil society as an actor to defend democracy. And so naturally we are looking with so much high hopes in the review of the EDAP, but also in the adoption of the Defense Democracy Pact. And I would be eager to try to understand if it's only looking at foreign interference or also looking at the problems that we have inside in our own house. And if planning to discuss with the society and civil society from its design through implementation phase.
Okay, thank you so much. I think because we are literally running out of time, what I'm going to do is now ask all of you to make your sort of final closing statements, your sort of takeaway from the event. Christina, I'll start with you first.
Yes, I think that this afternoon's discussion has very much shown that disinformation is a very complex phenomenon, and that's why it requires complex responses. I am convinced that with the code of practice, we have a very good toolbox in place. We have a good recipe, we have good ingredients, and we have a strong signatory base to implement it. At the same time, it's important to recall that the work has not stopped with the new code of practice. Quite the contrary. All these commitments and measures have to be put in practice. It has to be implemented, and we very much count on the strong signatory base to do that job in the upcoming weeks, months, and years.
Exactly, well said. Andras, if you go next, please.
I would say that I hope that after this first great step with the action plan, the second will be really as wide as it is needed, as deep and as strongly supported by financial and legislative initiatives to really be successful. Because if we want to protect our democracy, who else will do it? And just 3 lessons from, I think, which we have learned from the Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine is first is deterrence is key, I think, in this action plan. So those who are against democracy, there is a clear threat that they will be caught or they will have to pay for it, whichever way we see. So it should be, we should focus on deterrence. We should focus on resilience, and the real resilience we see in Ukraine, it's the people. And this is, again, it's the society, it's the civil society. If there would be no support by the Ukrainian society, no army would win, no president would lead. We need the society which has to be strengthened and really resilient. And I hope this will be a strong aspect in the document. And the third is, of course, democracy is expensive. But freedom and peace, they are priceless. They are, you cannot, it's beyond price. So it's definitely worth every cent we invest.
Well said. Alexandrina, please go next.
Yeah, maybe to come back to something that you were mentioning in the beginning, in this context of the democratic reckoning that happens in Europe. Maybe it's high time for Europe to overcome its purely economic dimension. It's already happening, of course, with the political union and the attempts to work to strengthen our democracies and the resilience of our societies. But I do think that an important thing would be to have just as strong a political and social union as we have an economic union. So, and all the action plans that are targeting to deliver a better democracy should have this in mind.
Well, I think the Ukraine war will definitely show that the EU can work together very well. Cornelia, your final thoughts.
Sure, I will also do this twofold as I started. When it comes to regulation, I think we need to acknowledge that regulation has to be practical in order to be implementable. So it has to be really not one size fits all. Services need to be recognized in their differences. I think the Code of Practice does a good job in acknowledging that. Also that it remains, that the impact assessment is very holistic. I think that is something that generally requires a little bit improvement. And then on the other hand, I think we've, of course, looked inwards mainly in this discussion, but I think the Commission, the European Union needs strong partners across the world with other democratic partners. So the Copenhagen Democracy Pledge and any other effort, transatlantic or beyond, is, I think, really of essence to safeguard also democracy within Europe.
Okay, so Daniel, over to you for final thoughts then.
Thank you. 3 quick points. I think we all share the recognition that one of the lessons learned from the past years is that there is no magic bullet, and we need all actors on board and many actions simultaneously. Downstream and upstream, I fully agree on the deterrence point. Second, related to that, inaction is worse than action. So I think we need to move fast. I hope that the proposals on the Media Freedom Act, the political ads can go through the legislative process fast, because they are really needed. And third point, and I think you mentioned it, we need to address the anxiety of people and solve the problems in a democratic way, the objective problems with prices and other things. Also calling out undemocratic actions early on, and we have seen in history where silence can lead. And this is what we will continue to do. And this is what
member states there.
No, alluding to the Defense of Democracy package, which will strengthen this direction of travel.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you to all the panelists. It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry that it seems our conversation had to be quickened because we started losing time. Thank you to everyone who has joined us here. And also thank you to our online audience. And don't forget, this is just the first of a series of debates on democracy and the role of tech. I'll be back on October 25th for our next debate, digital sovereignty and transatlantic relations. So don't miss that. So until next time, thank you for watching.